Good evening. Welcome to this, I guess it's a January edition of the Voices of Saanich. I'm Adam Olson. I'm the MLA for Saanich North and the Islands. We've got Tex McLeod, who is our, what title should we give you, Tex? Convener of the Voices of Saanich?
Coordinator or convener. I can be either one of those, Adam.
All right. And we've got Peter Wainwright, who's our guest this evening. So we're just going to let time for people to settle in, join us. We've got a good conversation tonight, I think, lined up about the housing legislation and the potential changes that could come from that legislation that was passed last fall. And looking forward to Peter's presentation and a little conversation that we'll have, and to also questions and answers later on this evening.
And Adam, Peter is saying that all of the municipalities in the area, Central Saanich, Sidney, North Saanich, all of them are having staff reports, and Peter is often showing up at these meetings and sharing his information. So we are very, very timely on this one.
So let me just clarify on that. North Saanich has yet to have this on their agenda. It's Sidney and Central Saanich that did. And I'm not actually presenting to the council meetings. I'm presenting, or I'm part of a panel discussion that's coming up on Sunday that Radio Sidney and the Sidney Community Association are doing. And the North Saanich Residents Association has invited me to their meeting on February 7th, which is again going to be about the housing legislation with a North Saanich focus. So, you know, I'm quite happy to share the work that we've been doing, looking into the legislation and the background, the issues, and so on. But it's an evolving topic. So there's going to be more to come.
Good one.
Well, I think that as we will unpack, or as Peter will help us unpack this evening, one of the challenges with understanding this legislation when it was at the debate stage was exactly how it was going to apply across the 85 communities that it applies in, or at least that they're targeting. So this is good work, good service being done by Peter this evening, and there's distinctions between the three municipalities on the Saanich Peninsula. The impacts will vary, and across the capital region even as well. So much more to learn about this. Tex, do you want to maybe get the evening started? We've got underway here.
Yes, let's do that. So let me just welcome everyone to our Voices of Saanich and the Islands tonight with our special guest, Peter Wainwright. Peter does a public affairs show at Radio Sidney, which is our local internet radio station. He'll tell us a little bit more about how that works. And we are very fortunate to have Peter tonight, because Peter has been a municipal councillor in Sidney for many years and has become a student of these regulations and the changes that they're going to bring. So he's here to share that with us, which is pretty wonderful. I'd like to take a moment as we get started to recognize that we're on the traditional territories of the Saanich people. We share this beautiful, beautiful part of the world, and we're very grateful to be a part of it, and we're very willing to take up what we need to do to help maintain and look after this part of the world, as Adam reminds us. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Adam, and thank you very much once again for joining us. Adam, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tex, and thank you for convening these really important conversations. And thank you to Peter Wainwright for being our guest this evening. And welcome to this episode of Voices of Saanich, and featuring a conversation about about the housing legislation that was passed last fall. If you received my newsletter, or if you happen to check out my website, last fall you might have seen me lighting my hair on fire about the way that these bills were brought in, and democracy on a couple of levels. And I don't have much hair to light on fire. I think that was the smirk that Peter gave me there. But yeah, I was quite disturbed at the level of discourse that was allowed during these important changes, or the changes that have been made in zoning across the province. It's probably the single largest zoning change in recent history in the province of British Columbia, and it will impact communities, about 85 communities across the province. I raised a lot of concerns about the lack of debate, the lack of awareness, the lack of ability for people to really understand what the potential impacts on their communities and in their local democracies. And I raised some concerns specifically to the bills over about a 2-week period. Anyhow, that's now past us. The bills were passed. A couple of them, I think, the government used closure to shut down debate and use their majority to pass the bills. And a couple of them passed because of they got through to the end of the debate. Either way, all of the bills have been passed and they've been regulated. Now the regulations have been passed in early December, about 7 days later. And so we're not talking about the hypothetical impacts of British Columbians. We're talking about the real impacts, and starting to understand how those impacts will play out in our communities. Tonight we'll take a broad look at it, and I think that we'll turn it over to Peter Wainwright here in a minute to walk us through a presentation, and then perhaps Peter, you and I can have a brief conversation about this, and then entertain some questions from the community here that's joined us online. So I invite people to put your questions in the Q&A. I see a couple of them there already, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go. And I barely made it here on time. There was an incident in downtown Victoria and slowed my transit travel home. So I'm going to turn my camera off when Peter's doing his presentation and eat my dinner. And hopefully I'll have wiped my face off, and we'll be ready for some questions when the presentation's done. It's really a joy to invite Peter to to lead the conversation this evening and to inform this discussion. As a longtime member of Sidney Council, it was over 20 years, Peter, that you were a member of Sidney Council. Very experienced, both at the council table and looking at these issues at a regional and at a provincial level. Peter brings a lot of understanding of the Local Government Act, land use planning and zoning, bylaws, and the local government process. And so it's wonderful that you've done the technical work. I've had the benefit of being interviewed by you on your Peninsula Affairs show on Radio Sidney, where we've engaged in these housing debates over the last couple of conversations that we've had. And so this will likely be some kind of an extension of that. Peter is now retired from local government politics, so you've got some time to look at this technical work. Maybe I'll leave some of the details to you to explain what you're up to these days, Peter. But I'll turn it over to you now to provide your presentation, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So I've got the presentation up there, and we should be able to get going through here. So I'm actually going to go through things, I guess, fairly quickly on some of the stuff. I'm not going to talk about Radio Sidney or some of the other background things, because there's actually a ton of stuff to cover, and I don't want to get sidetracked. So that's enough. Well, the only thing I'm going to say about the opening slide, I'm going to talk about the entire Saanich and the Gulf Islands, even though I confess that I tend to focus on the peninsula. So I am prepared to deal with what about the Islands Trust and all that kind of stuff. So to the meat. So the three pieces of legislation I'm going to be talking about tonight are Bill 44, which is the residential development one. It's the one that changed the single family zoning and has changed the way that residential development approvals happen. Bill 46 is about development financing, and it's specifically about development cost charges and amenity contributions. And Bill 47 is the transit-oriented areas one, with the theory being that you should put more housing density immediately around the important transit hubs, and the province stepping in to make that happen. So, first one to look at is Bill 44, and this is the one that makes the changes to the single family zones. And I think everybody's heard about this. So with respect to the single family zones, it's not precisely single family zone. It's any kind of zone that existed in November that allows a single family detached home or a duplex, okay? So there are a lot of zones that are very close to that might not be called single family, and yes, they are captured by this set of changes. So the first change, and you've heard some of this stuff on the news, is that secondary suites and or accessory dwelling units are basically allowed province-wide in a single family zone. Now this isn't, there are some exceptions, but if you're not on municipally operated sewer, you're not allowed to do the accessory dwelling unit. It's only a secondary suite. And this also does not apply if the lot is greater than, you can only do that if you're on a lot greater than 1 hectare. Now, an important bit of the fine print is the asterisk, which is down at the bottom. If you're in a local trust area per the Islands Trust Act, this does not apply. So that is, in fact, Salt Spring, it's Pender, it's Saturna. If you're in the Island Trust area, this does not apply. The last exemption I've got down there is a bit of a technicality. If you're in a municipality that adopted a rural land use bylaw under the provisions of Section 886, which was only in the Local Government Act in 1996 to 2000, then that is considered equivalent. And again, it doesn't apply. That's probably not relevant to us in the Saanich and the Gulf Islands. So I guess the key thing on that one, the secondary suite or the accessory dwelling unit in any single family zone, that would be basically the peninsula, but only in an area where you've got municipal sewer. So that's going to rule out quite a lot of the areas of North Saanich and some of Central Saanich. That comes into effect on July 1st, even though the bill's already passed. The next thing I think people heard about is that on any single family lot, you're going to be allowed 3, 4, or 6 units, depending on the size of the lot and how close you are to a bus stop with frequent service. So the details on this are, if you're in a municipality with more than 5,000 people and you're inside the urban containment boundary, if it's a single family lot less than or equal to 280 square meters, you can have 3 units. If it's more than 280, you can have 4. Again, this is only in municipalities with more than 5,000 people and only within the urban containment boundary. Okay, all of North Saanich is outside the urban containment boundary. All of Sidney is within the urban containment boundary. Central Saanich, some is in, some is out. And none of this would apply to the Islands Trust. And for the Saanich part of our of Saanich and Gulf Islands, it's going to be based on lot size and whether you're in the urban containment boundary. I think it all is, but I'm not that familiar. So this stuff kicks in on July 1st. There's also been, there's the possibility of 6 units being permitted. And the details on that one are, it's got to be a lot bigger than 280 square meters, and you have to be within 400 meters of a bus stop served by at least one route that stops every 15 minutes between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Monday to Friday. Again, municipalities over and within the urban containment boundary. And as a nicety, you're not allowed to impose parking requirements. Important thing here is we don't have any bus routes that have service stopping every 15 minutes. Not anywhere in Saanich and Gulf Islands. So this is doesn't apply to us unless our transit service improves quite a lot. Okay, one thing I should say, if people are trying to take notes, don't, because you can have a copy of the slide deck. And I know this is pretty information dense, so it'll be a lot easier to look at it maybe afterwards. Let's move on. So a key thing was that 280 square meters. So like, what is that? So 280 square meters is 20 meters by 14 meters if it's a rectangle. I mean, there are other ways you can get that, but for perspective, that is roughly 66 feet by 46 feet. And that's pretty small. That's less than a 14th of an acre. So if you're smaller than that, you're only allowed to do 3 units. And if you're more than that, you're allowed to do 4. So almost every single family lot in Sidney, with the exception of the ones that are considered small lot high density, are more than 280. So that would be like 4 units pretty much anywhere. And the interesting thing about the way it works is that if you're not in the development permit area now, and if you don't need a variance, starting July 1st, the zoning is in effect, and all you have to do is apply for a building permit. That's it. No rezoning, it's not getting reviewed by advisory planning, whatever. So that's how that'll roll out. Key thing is that 280 square meters is actually pretty small. So if you live in a single family detached, you should kind of think about what does that mean in relation to your lot? Are you above the threshold or no? Okay, this was only part of it. Everybody was really interested in what you're allowed to do on single family in terms of density, 3 unit, 4 unit, 6 unit, that kind of thing. But okay, the other details here that I should go through are the exemptions. So this 3 to 6 unit thing, if you're not served by municipal sewer and water, that doesn't apply. So no increase in density unless you're on municipally operated sewer and water. It's not good enough if it's privately operated sewer. It's actually got to be operated by a municipality or a regional district. Next one probably doesn't matter. If your lot's bigger than 4,000 square meters, this doesn't apply. If you've got a heritage designation on it or a heritage agreement, that's still valid. So that may impact whether you can do the 3 to 6 units. If you are in a development permit area to protect from hazardous conditions, and that would be something like unstable slopes, floodplain, that kind of thing, per that particular section of the Local Government Act, to the extent that the protections are necessary, you can't do the 3 to 6. So if an engineer looks at it and says, yeah, you can do 6, it doesn't affect the hazard, then you can do 6. But it's not an automatic. The development permit area is still there. Now, we get interesting when we start talking about development permit areas for other reasons, and particularly environmentally sensitive areas. And the way this reads is that those environmentally sensitive area and development permit area guidelines would still apply, provided this does, using that authority does not unreasonably obstruct the intent of this legislation. So they're basically saying you can do it if there is a legitimate and you're not being unreasonable trying to obstruct the extra density. Another point is that provincial legislation like ALR continues to apply, and that would also be Riparian Protection Act, Drinking Water Protection Act. There are a few other ones that may impact whether you can do 3, 4, whatever on that single family lot. And the last thing to keep in mind is that if you've got any covenants or easements or other charges registered on title, they're still there. And interestingly, the town of Sidney has in fact registered covenants on a lot of the small lots where they approved a development permit for form and character. They actually registered the plans as a covenant on title for some of them. So that's not always the case. And Sidney, I'm sure, has not done it consistently, but one also has to look and make sure there isn't stuff like that on the title, because that can affect things. Okay, now I'm out of the what they did to the single family lot stuff. The next thing that Bill 44 did, and probably more significant, is they changed the process of how residential developments are approved. So the first thing, effective immediately, is that public hearings are no longer allowed for residential developments that are consistent with the official community plan. And there's some other process changes as well. And in fact, on Monday night, Sidney Council had a zoning amendment that was consistent with the official community plan. There was no public hearing, and it went from first reading to final adoption the same night. So you snooze, you lose on that one. There was an opportunity for public comment on whatever, but not a public hearing, not advertised as a public hearing, and it was over and done the same night. So if you weren't aware of it, well, it's too late. The next big thing is there's a requirement for each municipality to update their zoning bylaw to implement these small-scale multi-unit housing changes. And those changes to the municipal zoning bylaw have to be done by June 30th this year. So the clock is ticking. There's less than 6 months to get that done. And these are the changes to single-family zone to implement the 3 unit, 4 unit, 6 unit kind of thing. That's what they're talking about here. And the secondary suites, wherever that's relevant. The next thing they're requiring is that each municipality must update their housing needs report using a provincial methodology that's going to be released. And a key difference between what was done previously and what they're going to be requiring is what was done previously looked 5 years ahead. They're requiring this to be a 20-year projection. Now, this updated housing needs report has to be done by January 1st of next year. So again, the clock is ticking. It's got to be done by the end of December, and they have not yet released the methodology that the municipalities need to use. Then, when you've got that housing needs report done, you're required to update your OCP to provide the forecasted 20-year housing supply per your housing needs report. And you must have that done by the end of next year, 2025. But we don't know what that methodology is yet and exactly what that's going to mean, but there's your timeline. You've got to get that OCP update done to provide that necessary amount of housing. And then you have to update your zoning bylaw to pre-zone all the areas to match your OCP. And that also has to be done by the end of next year. So those are some pretty significant deadlines that municipalities have to comply with. The extent to which you have to implement the single family stuff really determines how much work you've got to get done by the end of June. Okay. And just a couple of pictures, don't even try to read them. These were in the Peninsula News Review. You're already starting to see notices and changes happening. So that was the one on the left is the notice of that zoning bylaw amendment that was consistent with the official community plan. No public hearing, over and done that night. Okay, now I'm on to Bill 46, which is the development financing one. And this is in effect now, but it's going to take a while for it to actually get implemented by the municipalities. So if you don't know what development cost charges are, they're a tool that local governments can use so that growth pays for the infrastructure required to service the growth rather than current taxpayers. So what they do is they take the official community plan, they look at how much growth is allowed for in the community plan. An engineer looks at how much do we have to upgrade the infrastructure to service that growth. Then they go, how much will that cost? And then they figure out what's a fair charge for each unit of development to contribute towards that amount. On a positive note, Bill 46 expands the scope of infrastructure that can be funded like that. And a nicety, for example, is it used to be that you could not use DCCs to fund the municipal share of some highway infrastructure project, like a roundabout for Amazon, or I should say growth in that general area. Now it is actually under this new one, it's possible to use DCCs to help pay for that, which is kind of appealing. They've also come up with a new tool they call amenity cost charges. And that is a tool that local governments can use replacing community amenity contributions. So this is, you don't negotiate it while the development is under approval. You figure it out all in advance in a bylaw, and off you go and you can do it. And that's effective now. So consequences of these are that there are some changes that are going to mean that local governments will need to review their amenity contribution policies and references to amenities in their zoning bylaw and OCP. This is kind of discretionary when they want to do it, but they've got to make these changes if they want to use kind of the new tools. And it's a pretty lengthy process to actually implement that. I don't think I need to say anything more about this. I don't think people are too focused on this, but it is pretty important stuff overall for the municipalities. Okay, on to Bill 47, the transit-oriented areas one. So this one is the one where, you know, the idea is to put the density around the transit stations. So what they've done is transit-oriented areas, or TOAs, are defined in a regulation, and they are areas that are within 800 meters from the top tier of transit hub, which happens to be SkyTrain stations, or they're within 400 meters of the next three tiers, which are bus exchanges, West Coast Express stations, and bus stops that are prescribed in the regulations. Okay, so the regulations are in There are 2 orders of council. Those are the magic numbers. They designate 52 transit-oriented areas. So those are designated. They're there now. And what I can say is there are no bus stops prescribed in the regulations at all. And there are no transit-oriented areas in the regulations on the Saanich Peninsula or the Gulf Islands or anywhere in the Saanich and Gulf Islands riding. The nearest TOA is the Uptown Exchange in Saanich. Okay. Now, just for the sake of completing the conversation, the obligations that a local government, your municipality, has if you've got one of these TOAs is you've got to allow the minimum levels of density, size, and dimensions that are specified in the regulations. I'll show you those. You've got to remove the parking requirements for off-street residential, except for disabled. So you can have parking requirements for commercial if it's mixed use, and you can have parking requirements for disabled, but the developer figures out how much parking is going to be provided, if any, for the residential units. Now, there's another thing in here that says the municipality must consider the guidance and details in the provincial policy manual when planning or amending zoning bylaws. Now, we'd have to drill down pretty deep to go through that, and there's really no point because, as I said, there are no TOAs anywhere in our riding. Okay, another important detail, if a parcel is partly within that magic radius, it's considered wholly within. That's actually in the regulation, not discretionary. And there are a few exemptions to this thing. So if the land is zoned for industrial or agricultural use and it's within the TOA, it's exempt. If it's ALR, it's exempt. Floodplains, hazard areas, ESAs, heritage designations, all those kinds of things still have an effect. Okay, now let's go into the details a bit. So there are 4 tiers of these transit facilities, with the top tier being the SkyTrains. And I mentioned that it was up to 800 meters. There are 3 distances, first 200 meters, the next 200 meters, then the 400 after it. And if you're within the first 200 meters, you're required to allow a minimum floor area ratio of 5.0, and a minimum number of stories that's allowed is 20. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but floor area ratio of 5.0 means that the total floor area can be 5 times the area of the parcel. Okay, and I know this is hard to visualize, so an important thing I'm going to say is if you look at Sydney's zoning bylaw for the downtown commercial zone, it allows 3.0 FAR and up to 4 stories. So if a 4-story development is allowed to have 3 times the floor area of the parcel, you kind of think that a 20-story development would be a little more than, it's not even twice. And that kind of ripples through farther down. But I won't dwell on this stuff. If you're near a SkyTrain, you could be up to 20. If you're near a West Coast Exchange one, you could be up to 12 stories. If you're within 200 meters of Uptown, you could be up to 10. And if you're one of these tier 4 things that is yet to be defined, it might be up to 6. But that 6 would actually have a minimum allowed floor area ratio less than what they would allow in Sydney's downtown core. Wow, that looks well thought out. Anyway, moving on. That's what Uptown looks like. So there's the Uptown Exchange. This is generally Uptown. That's 200 meters. This is 400 meters. I don't know if people can see my little arrow, but off on the side here, this general area is all single family. So what they've done is they've just said, X number of stories throughout this. And looking at it, as I said, any parcel that's partly in is considered wholly within. So that's wholly within. This parcel that is barely in the radius is wholly within, with about 90% of it actually lying outside. Anyway, that's what it looks like. So the last thing that I should do in the overview kind of side of it is this is what the timeline looks like if I put all that stuff together. So you can kind of see how it plays out. So effective now, public hearings are no longer allowed for residential developments consistent with the OCP. The transit-oriented areas are in effect. They've been designated. Those zoning changes are live. And the development cost charge stuff is there. It's also in effect, but not really until the municipalities implement it. Now, there was an interesting thing that was on the provincial webpage that got deleted, and then they actually made the announcement. So they have actually announced that they're distributing 51 million to local governments to help deal with the cost of doing this stuff. And the 3 peninsula municipalities have been told they're each getting a little over 200,000 to do that. And that's supposed to happen sometime this month. According to their media releases and their webpage, the housing needs report methodology is going to be released, quote, early 2024. Okay, so we're kind of here in the timeline waiting for them to release that. The municipalities have this task of reviewing their amenity contribution policies and deciding if they're going to adopt the amenity cost charge bylaw. That totally up to them where they fit that in. So that is a discretionary kind of thing. We've also been told that guidance is going to be provided to the municipalities for the updating of the OCPs and the zoning bylaws that are going to be required at the end of 2025. Okay. Next one, I mentioned that these single-family zoning changes have to be brought into effect. The zoning bylaw must be updated to include those by June 30th, less than 6 months away. Now, the municipalities are required also to designate those TOD areas in their zoning bylaw if they have one within their municipality. And they also have to have made the necessary adjustments to remove the parking requirements. We don't have the need to do that currently, but if somebody suddenly decided we needed to, that would have to get done by June 30th, okay? And on July 1st, those changes to the single family zoning come into effect. And I've mentioned that you've got a deadline to update your housing needs report. That's January 1st of next year. And then December 31st, you've got to have updated your OCP to provide the 20-year housing supply that you forecast. And you've got to update your zoning bylaw to pre-zone to match what's in your OCP. Okay. At this point, I've actually covered sort of the overview of what's in the legislation. I could do a bit more of a deep dive, like there's exemptions and some other details and stuff, but there's really not a lot of point, particularly on the ones that don't apply to us. There are, however, some concerns about the legislation overall and what's coming down the pipe that I would like to raise. And I'm not going to kind of focus on was this legislation the right thing to do or stuff like that, but rather Peninsula perspective on some concerns, perspectives of having been in local government for a while and things that maybe we've learned to try to avoid. So let me just get into this. So the first thing up is that one of the things you learn in local government is that development rights are very expensive to take away. So if we make a mistake and we give somebody zoning that lets them have development rights that we decide weren't appropriate, we do have the power to take it away, but courts make it very clear that we have to compensate when we do that. So whenever you're uncertain about whether this is the right thing to do or not, it tends to make sense to go slow and be cautious about how you implement it. So the development rights that are associated with these transit-oriented areas, already there. If that gave you a zone, a windfall, Mr. Developer, it would be really expensive to claw that back. Interesting thing though is the development rights that are associated with the changes to single-family zones aren't in effect till July 1st. So there is in fact time to tweak those without it being expensive. You're not taking development rights away. So should we do something like that? Should we have a hard look? I mean, obviously we put a lot of thought into this. We don't make mistakes. So here we are looking at the Columbia Station transit-oriented area. This is in one of the regulations. This is in the city of New Westminster. And you can see my little arrow pointing to a parcel that I'm highlighting in blue, which is in Surrey. And it's falling within that 800-meter radius, but gee, that's the Fraser River that you're going to have to walk across. Don't think you can bicycle there. And in fact, it'll be well over twice that distance if you want to try to get there on a bicycle, for example. Like this is in no way is that within 800 meters of that transit station. Now, to make life better, that parcel is barely within the radius. There are a few other ones around it that are partly in it, but if you're partly in, you're all in, right? So that parcel, unless it has some exemption because it's industrial or whatever, just picked up that full set of development rights. Okay, so the concerns I'd like to raise first about the Bill 44 one is this housing needs report. We're expecting that methodology to come out sometime soon, and the municipalities are going to have to use that methodology to forecast a 20-year housing supply, which they then have to provide that amount of housing in their OCP and pre-zone to match it. And there's a lot of scope to this. Like the methodology hopefully will be similar to what was done previously in the housing needs assessment, but they are going to be specifying methodology. They're probably going to be specifying the data sources to use. And will that housing supply simply be a number of units, or are they going to go, you need this much residential, you need this much non-market, and that sort of thing? So we really do not have any idea what the consequences of that are going to be, and we're not going to be able to evaluate that until we actually see that methodology that we're expecting soon. So that's one of the concerns. We'd really like to see that methodology, and it's quite possible that the impact of that will be very significant. I suspect in the case of Town of Sidney, with a lot of the single family having the potential to go 4-unit because of the single family change, that will provide a lot of potential housing supply that may mitigate the impact on Sidney. But in North Saanich, with none of those changes applying, they're going to have to figure out how to modify their OCP to provide whatever that 20-year projection is. And that could be a significant change to the OCP. So this is, again, I'm talking kind of big picture concerns. Okay. Next one is the importance of transit plans. So reading the regulations, this allowance for 6 units on a parcel It's not when the bus stop is there, it's when the bus stop is planned. So if they come up with a transit plan, which is indicating an improvement in service in the future, that's going to provide that at least 15-minute level, that is the trigger for the 6-unit happening in single family. Wow. So we're going to want to watch very carefully the development of the transit plans for our region, because they have implications. That particular 6-unit trigger would not apply in North Saanich because you're outside the urban containment boundary. It would apply in Sidney. It would apply in whatever parts of central Saanich are within the urban containment boundary when a transit plan comes out that says there's going to be that kind of service. Okay. Now, here we go with another thing that's in Bill 44, and this one is not too subtle, but the wording is maybe complicated. Section 457.1, the following powers must not be exercised in a manner that unreasonably prohibits or restricts the use or density of use required to be permitted by all the stuff in Bill 44. And then they give us a list of the powers that you can't use. And the first two are Section 488, which is development permit areas. And the second one, wow, land use regulation bylaw, zoning bylaw, OCP, like everything, and land use permits. So basically what they're saying is, hi, municipal council, you can't unreasonably restrict the density that Bill 44 says, period. And at Sidney Council last night, one of the councillors asked, well, who decides whether that, what's unreasonably restricting? So the simple answer to that is, well, the province can make that decision anytime they want. And in fact, they've released a policy manual where they give an indication of what they think is reasonable and what's not reasonable. And I guess the other thing, though, that maybe is a bit worse than that is, if I'm a property owner and I think my municipality is being unreasonable about what I can do on my waterfront property, I'm going to file for judicial review that they're being unreasonable about prohibiting the density that I'm allowed. And that fights between the developer and the municipality. The province is not involved at all. And my experience as a municipal councillor is we're really reluctant to get into that kind of fight. The courts often side with the property owner, and they often have deep pockets. Okay, so that's simply a concern about not sure how this one's going to play out. Sidney, for example, has a lot of these small lot areas that are in fact development permit areas for form and character. Because of that, you have to apply for the development permit and you get referred to the Advisory Planning Commission, and the process for approving the development takes longer, which the province thinks is unreasonable. And that's kind of in their policy manual. It's quite possible that they will come out with some additional clarification and say in their guidance for your zoning bylaw that thou shalt remove the form and character EP areas. So waiting to see what happens from that one. And then related is the question about areas expected to be frequently inundated due to sea level rise. Now, these would typically be considered or may reasonably be considered a development permit area because of the flooding hazard. So the previous thing about not being unreasonable does in fact apply, but you're doing it to protect from a hazard. So you do have some wiggle room here, but you're only able to exempt the property from the additional density if you've got a qualified professional certifying that increasing the density would significantly increase the threat or risk from the hazardous condition. Well, more people living in the area that's going to be inundated, more, valued property. Yeah, you can argue that increases the risk, no problem. But then it goes, the threat or risk from the hazardous condition cannot be practically mitigated. Okay, well, it's pretty easy to build a seawall, even if the municipality doesn't want you to. Obviously, that condition can be practically mitigated. So that basically blocks you from trying to exempt those areas. And here, what I really am seeing kind of as an issue here is that we know that we're going to have to do regional or sub-regional planning to deal with sea level rise. Like, you can't have a seawall and then a gap and then another seawall and expect things to work. You've got to take a coordinated approach to this. But what they've done is they've basically set it up so that waterfront property owners have got this set of rights associated with Bill 44 that look like you can't really block them. And they could really be a barrier to a coordinated approach to dealing with that in an area like Roberts Bay, for example, or CM Harbor or whatever. So it seems to me that the better approach would have been to say, look, there's a risk of doing this, and maybe we should not do it in phase one. Maybe we should see how the rest of the stuff works out, do a little more consultation on this one, and decide later whether we want to bring it in. Because it's easy to add it in later. It's expensive to try to take it away if you decided it was a mistake. And I think on this one, my big concern is not to do with the density at all. It's simply about the need for removing barriers to regional approaches to managing sea level rise, because it's going to be necessary to have a coordinated approach to it. Okay, I'm done on Bill 44. I actually have no concerns about Bill 46, at least nothing of substance that I would bring up. Bill 47, that transit-oriented areas one, I'm going to circle back to that in transit plans. We know that at some point in the future, the peninsula is going to need a transit facility and better transit service, and we're going to qualify for that lowest tier in the transit-oriented areas. Don't know when that's going to happen, but it's kind of inevitable. And so the thing that you recognize from this, though, is that community engagement and peninsula involvement in those transit plans is going to be critical, because those transit plans are also going to dictate land use plans, right? So that's a pretty significant thing that every municipality is going to be interested in. So, for example, what would North Saanich feel if they decide they're going to designate McTavish Exchange as a tier 4? That would have some pretty big implications, because nothing in Bill 44 is applying to them, but this thing suddenly would. And a particular issue here, given how critically important it is for the municipalities all to be involved in that kind of planning stuff, is they're not. Currently, and this is per the BC Transit Act, the peninsula has one seat on the Victoria Regional Transit Commission, which is the one that does these transit plans. That seat rotates among the peninsula mayors. It's currently Mayor Windsor. He's doing a wonderful job. Kudos to him and all that. But there's a governance principle here that every municipality should have a voice, because suddenly this stuff is really important. That's actually it on Bill 47. Okay. Last thing is some concerns about this overall timeline that I went through. And I tried to remove any of the fluff here. So we've got stuff that's in effect now. We're waiting for that housing needs report methodology to come out. We're hoping it's going to come out soon. The zoning bylaws got to get updated to incorporate this Bill of 44 stuff by June 30th. Those changes come into effect July 1st. The housing needs report has to be done by January 1st. And then you've got to get your OCP update, including that 20-year forecast, and update your zoning bylaw by December 31st. So there is quite a lot of stuff that municipalities need to get done. And of course, this is not the only stuff on their plate. A big concern is, so 13 municipalities in CRD are going to update their OCPs all in the same year. And they're all going to have to submit those. Each municipality is going to have to submit that OCP for review to CRD. They've got to approve it under the regional growth strategy. And it's also got to be approved by adjacent municipalities, First Nations, and there's quite a bit of consultation stuff involved. But the bottleneck we've seen in the past is CRD, because they literally take months to process one OCP amendment through CRD board. So what happens when they're trying to do 13? Okay, that doesn't look pretty. I guess that really is the overall concern, is just the amount of stuff coming down the pipe and the load it's putting on our local governments, their ability to handle this stuff. At the Sidney Council meeting on Monday night, the staff report indicated that it was a significant workload. It was going to modify the zoning bylaw update they had in process. They were going to have to reduce the amount of public consultation they had planned to be able to essentially meet the deadlines. Now, anything beyond July 1st is speculative, because we don't even know what the methodology is going to be. But anyone who needs a consultant to help them prepare their housing needs report, there's a limited pool of consultants in the province that do that kind of stuff. And every municipality looking for help is going to be wanting the same pool of consultants. And the same thing is true of a lot of other pieces of this. So there could be quite a bit of competition for the consultants and professionals they're going to need to help roll this out. So I guess there's a concern that this is going to be, how do you say, efficient, timely, smooth process. But anyway, that's where that is. So that's it on the timeline. That's it on the concerns. I'll show you my next slide. This is for reference only. This is literally every piece of legislation that's relevant in the orders of council and the policy manuals. And if you ask for a copy of the slide deck, you've got all that. And that's it. So Adam.
Yeah, that's it. Just that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess the big overall message is still waiting for the shoe to drop. Have a good idea what the municipalities need to do in the next 6 months, but it's pretty speculative beyond there. And it's possible that there are going to be some new announcements that change that.
Yeah, it is a lot, as I think people are probably feeling from your presentation, Peter. First, you want to maybe stop sharing your screen there? We can.
Sure. Actually, do you want me to leave it there in case I have to go back to one, or I'll pull it up if we need
Oh,
to?
yeah. Okay, sure. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to digest. It was a lot to digest, the way that it was brought out. I think we had about a week and a half to look through multiple pieces of legislation, and it took everything we had to just kind of stretch the debate out long enough to be able to understand what it was that we were looking at. And as you pointed out, reading legislation is difficult on good days, and understanding how it applies. Government lawyers take a long time to ensure that they understand how the wording and the language in the bill impacts the outcome of it. And we, as the opposition critics, were given just a matter of a few days, and so we did what we could to try to draw the debate out and the discussion out for as long as we could. But to understand what the full scope of it is. And there was a question in here about the 20-year housing needs forecast as an example. I've got, I mean, there's so many ways for me to get into this conversation with you, but there's some questions here. And one of them around this, I have the broader question: to achieve what, right? You can have a 20-year forecast. What are you, and I guess this is what we're waiting for from the government, is to see what they're going to do. But the long-term demographic trends and how that's going to be informing this 20-year housing forecast. Do you have any sense of what that looks like, and how? Because I think it is one of those pieces that will then drive the OCP and the what our communities look like here and across the province for the next 2 decades.
Yeah, I have to say, no, I really don't have an idea of what they're going to do with that. If I had to guess, I think they're going to simply talk about a total number of units rather than this many non-market and this many market. And the reason I say that is it's very difficult if you look at, say Sydney's downtown and say this parcel is the right one for affordable, this one's the right one for rental. Whereas normally what happens is, the market will come forward and say, I've got a project, I'm interested in doing this. And so I think it'll be challenging if they do say more than simply a number of units. And if all they do is say a number of units, then you're back to the problem we currently face, which is that the majority of them are going to be targeting people downsizing, retired people moving from somewhere else. It'll be perpetuating the problem we've been seeing. So I'm not sure there's an easy way out of this.
No. The other piece that is a trigger point here has nothing. Well, it's the accessibility of transit. Mm-hmm. And there are many advocates on the Saanich Peninsula that have been calling for a rapid bus system to be created to connect the airport and the ferry with uptown. And so we saw the first, I guess, just in the context of your presentation, this is not something that's happening now, but I feel like the province, with the investment at Mount Newton, the first investment that happened at Sayward, I think we're on track to building out a rapid bus system, which I think in that context, even just a plan for that, as soon as they articulate a plan for it, as you mentioned, it changes substantively this presentation, and it changes to a point this presentation.
That to me is one of the really key things here, is that suddenly we recognize that transit planning, long-term transit planning, is going to have significant land use implications for us. And it's not, that you should try to make the housing around the transit to make it more efficient or whatever, but you're required to. So, these TOA rules kick in the minute we have a plan. It could be a 10-year plan, and it'll trigger it. Yeah. So I'd like to see, the the Transit Act get amended so that every municipality on the peninsula has a rep.
It's really fundamental. Well, absolutely, it's going to be necessary. I think there's going to need to be a different governance structure for the Transportation Commission governance structure change.
To be honest, they should think about should they just stop that and give it all to CRD, because they're doing the regional planning anyway. But anyway, that's they did not think this out, and governance right now is not fair.
The governance at the local government level just changed dramatically. The role of a municipal councillor is dramatically different, I think, today than it was before, in the sense that there was a focus, there was a requirement for local government to look at the industrial, the commercial, and the residential. The residential has largely been removed from that, and now to me, it's going to be a much greater focus for local governments on trying to deliver the services to the potentially, increased population, and making sure that the infrastructure is in place in order to be able to support that growth. Because with that residential growth will come necessarily some commercial and some industrial growth to support it. So that's just kind of a crude assessment of what might have changed for a local government. What's your sense of that?
I don't think the role of a councillor has changed that much. There's a change of focus in that the OCP has suddenly become a lot more important, and the zoning bylaw less so, because the zoning bylaw must match your OCP, right? So Sidney's got a lot of multifamily residential zones, condos, apartments, townhomes, not the single family stuff, but roughly 60%, let's say, of Sidney is in that single family going to get affected. And okay, suddenly maybe I'm allowed to do 4 units on my lot. Not maybe, I will be. But that doesn't mean I'm going to do it. And where they've made these changes before, that doesn't mean you're going to have an instant uptake. Particularly where you have issues about servicing and things like that, because that is the best reason that is a legitimate reason for slowing it down. The thing is, councillors don't spend time on single family development anyway. Like you normally apply for a building permit unless you need a variance. You need a variance, you still got to come to council. So that hasn't changed. What will have changed is the amount of effort that goes into an OCP, because we all realize that that's going to immediately translate into zoning changes, right? And updating an OCP is already a pretty big, process. This just kind of adds to it, from what I can see.
Well, there's frequency for requirements of updating your 20-year housing needs forecast. And there's, I think, a requirement now to increase the frequency at which you review your official community plan. I guess partly what's informing the official community plan is coming from outside the community rather than from generated, because there were those conditions around the transportation, the transit piece. There are some influences from the outside on what your official community plan is going to be required. That the methodology that they're going to use for the housing needs forecast as an example.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of technical stuff they have not rolled out, but when you look at an OCP, like Sidney's OCP, how much population does that represent, right? So if I amend it and I do X, Y, and Z, how do I figure out what the new population is because of that? Well, it's easy when you say it's one residential unit, and then you kind of go, StatsCan says one residential unit is 2.1 people on average. But what do you do when it's 1,000 square feet of floor area? How many residents is that? And okay, the province is going to give us some rules on how to calculate all that stuff. Oh, will it be different from the way we do it now? I have no idea. Like they yet to come.
One of the there's an article in the CBC today about the lack of planners. You mentioned this in your presentation. This was something that as the conversation about the incoming bills, this was prior to the fall before they were tabled. I was hearing from local governments. When we go to the Union of BC Municipalities, we hear local governments are having a hard time getting the full complement of staff that they need in order to be able to do this. It's not a surprise by the province. They put $51 million, I think, on the table in order to support municipalities with. I mean, some of these costs will be offset by that. It'll be interesting to see if that's enough or how much that fund is going to be used. But this, one of the concerns that you raised that I think is really legitimate, and that is the ability to actually meet these timelines just based on the capacity of the industry to be able to support the massive amount of changes that are going to be required.
Yeah. There's quite a bit of work involved in making the changes to the bylaws that are going to be necessary, and figuring out that kind of detail. And there's a limited pool of consultants that you can, that are available that you can draw on. And like you say, even hiring planners. Central Saanich, in their meeting on Monday, their staff recommendation was that they were going to hire a contract planner for 18 months to help them deal with the workload. So hopefully they can find somebody.
Yeah, hopefully they all can find somebody. All right, so let's get to a few of the questions that are here. I think we've responded to a few of them, sort of, and we've kind of touched on them. John Evans asked a question of what happens with the next election. As Peter pointed out, these bills are law. There's timelines, and they've been regulated, so it doesn't matter what. I mean, it's always up. A new government can come in and change the laws, just like the BC NDP created these laws. A new government, a different brand, could come in and change it. But these are the current laws. Any further comment to that, Peter? Or?
No, you're dead on that. I mean, new government, like, easiest thing would be perhaps extending a timeline, but it'll be very easy for them to say, we inherited this. It's, we have to live with it.
So, John, there's a question here about, here, I'll just read it out. One or more than one municipality. Workforce commuters are largely lost in the current process. Given transit and housing needs impacts on this new set of laws, how can we improve the reflection of commuting needs reflected in planning? So I think, like, the identifying workforce housing, the housing that was created here with this bill, Peter, is market housing. Now, I asked this question, and so the housing market will produce these units, and they will be available on the market for what the market, I guess, produces them at. So this, I think, fits into the comment that you made that we're largely going to be where we're at today, which is the housing market producing the houses at the current price, and to target workforce housing or something like that, it's still going to require some kind of an intervention, I think, in order to get the affordability that at least some demographics, some people are going to need in order to be able to live on the peninsula. This bill doesn't, in and of itself, necessarily mean that there's going to be an increase in housing affordability for the workforce to just stay out here on the Saanich Peninsula and work in our industrial park, say, for an example.
Yeah, this is that's a complicated question, and I guess I don't want to weasel out of answering it, but the thing is, we're still waiting for them to give us a lot of the critical details on, what's the methodology for the housing needs report. They haven't designated any of these tier 4 things. Are they going to? There's stuff that we don't know. So it would be incredibly speculative for me to comment on how that's going to affect affordability for workforce or anything else. I mean, the yeah, it really it will just be very speculative. So, they put out that modeling report on how it was going to affect things, and that's based on a ton of assumptions. And are they going to put all those assumptions in a regulation and drop it in front of us over the next couple of months? Or I have no idea. And so I have talked to some developers, and there's some thought that when the full thing is implemented and it's rolled out 2 years from now, that it should reduce the cost of development approvals, which should have a ripple effect of reducing, costs. But that won't be the case for the single family because it doesn't have a development approval process now, so you can't reduce that cost anymore. And if my single family lot can suddenly allow 4 units, the market says my lot just got more valuable. And I don't know to what extent, but that one, I think I would, my opinion kind of matches that. I think that's what's going to happen on the single family. But if we're talking townhomes and condos and apartments, and workforce housing often is the apartment kind of form or the townhouse form, maybe in a couple of years that will make some difference.
We can talk real estate market economics in another forum. That's not really the focus that you've done. Kind of dragged it into it here a little bit, but it is a big part of it, and how this, a big part in the debate that I brought into it was the impact that when you have single property owners and multiple property owners, and the multi-generational impact that has in comparison to people who are born into families that are not property owners. And there's some really important economics there that we need to be cognizant of, because there's a 1.5 million renters in British Columbia. Most of those are non-property owners. And what impact does this law have on them? And I think that there is a worthwhile conversation, just a different voices of Saanich. So let's go back to the questions here, Peter. And I appreciate you bringing the expertise here to the actual technical aspects of what's happening here. So I'm going to get back into it. I think, as you said, this does not impact the Southern Gulf Islands and the Islands Trust currently, and unlikely in any short-term piece, but certainly it sits outside it now, correct?
Yep. Yeah, there's a very clear, it does not apply on Island Trust land.
Thank you. Okay, so Michael asked a question. If a transit authority planned a new bus route with a 14-minute service versus a 16-minute service, it sounds like that affects the development potential of all lots within 200 meters.
400, but yes.
400 meters.
Yeah.
So a 2-minute transit difference has a dramatic, or some impact anyways, on whether they're going to be considered for these bills or not, these new laws.
Yeah. Yeah, it, like I say, the transit plans become very important in terms of what they mean for development and density.
So I want to talk about reasonable here and unreasonable for just a second, because so I was in a committee meeting. It was the Freedom of Information or Protection of Information. Anyway, one of these special committees that I sit on to review the act, and on that was Andrew Wilkinson, the former leader of the BC Liberals. And we got into this conversation about, well, who's determining what's reasonable and what's unreasonable? And being the lawyer that he was, he stepped in and he said, surely we have a legal definition of what's reasonable. And so it's actually a legally defined thing. And it often gets these conversations hung up because it's like, well, who's determining reasonable and unreasonable? And as you pointed out, the court has defined reasonable and what's unreasonable. And this is something that we do fairly confidently, I think, in the courts. And if it's unfortunate that, we might be creating a situation where we're increasing the opportunity for the courts to determine whether something's reasonable or unreasonable, but that is the outcome. And largely, when we're taking a look at it, I think our bureaucracies understand and are able to define it as well. So I just thought that I'd mention that.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's totally by court precedent.
Another thing too around this, and it's in kind of an interesting nuanced piece, but I think that it highlights some of the aspects of the way that they brought these forward. So current heritage designations, yep, they can't change, or they can remain in place. Sorry, I should put it that way. Yep. They can remain in place, but this really significantly limits future heritage designations.
No. You can't do it unreasonably. So if I tried to put a heritage designation on a property that had no heritage value at all, and I'm doing it solely to make it difficult to do the 3 or 4 or 6 units, I can't do that. But if I'm looking at a bona fide heritage property that we simply have not designated yet, for the sake of argument, well, no, Beacon Wharf's not a residence, but there are plenty of ones around that are significant, or history or whatever, that are not designated yet. Sidney probably has several, and Central Saanich designated a couple of properties at the owner's request only a couple of years ago. So I mean, it can happen. There's no barrier to doing it as long as you're doing it for legitimate heritage reasons.
But as long as you're doing it for a legitimate heritage reason. So identifying places with indigenous heritage, for an example. So the Central Saanich slope on Mount Newton, on the other side of the south side of Mount Newton.
Yeah. Wow. So, you can do a heritage designation for an area like Chinatown. And in fact, in doing something, and Oak Bay has got an area that's got a designation as the neighborhood, not the individual buildings. And it's a kind of a foreign character thing. So there are heritage designations that can be done like that. What they're saying is, you can't do that for the purposes of blocking the 4 units. So you might say minimize the lot coverage, but you can still do 4 units with a maximum of 11 meters and so on. And, the heritage designation or agreement is going to have conditions about minimizing lot coverage and site disturbance and sight lines, and I don't know what all the stuff would be, but you can do something like that with it, and still say, and on these single family lots, you can still do 4 units. You just minimize that lot coverage, whatever, right? So it's not a complete barrier, but it makes it a little more complicated. And the other thing it does is it opens up the door for the property owner to go, you're being unreasonable about this. I want a court to do a judicial review of your decision.
Yeah, and I would say that it has the potential of cornering us into doing heritage designations that we've always done, and not considering heritage designations from an indigenous perspective. Let's just say, for an example, because recognizing a sacred site and saying that, then we're basically taking it to the court and saying, is it unreasonable to say that certain places, right? So anyway, this is one that around heritage designations got, I remember sitting on Central Saanich Council when we were, when there were a certain type of heritage designation that was made and others were not. So anyway, it just want to make sure that as we look, especially with reconciliation, that we're able to preserve some of these spaces that are recognized as sacred spaces, without these bills negatively impacting them, I guess was what I was raising. So
I
okay.
think it makes it more complicated, but I don't think it totally rules it out. The other thing it makes more complicated, like Sydney's got a lot of has designated environmentally sensitive areas in its OCP, got guidelines, and they will continue even after Bill 44 kicks in, to the extent that they don't interfere, right? For North Saanich, which is going through its OCP process and thinking about creating environmentally sensitive areas, so these didn't exist in advance of the legislation, suddenly it's a lot more complicated, because now you have to look at, am I being reasonable? How does this relate to the policy manual? And all that kind of good stuff. I think you have to be more cautious about it as a municipality, and that generally means it costs more.
How does this impact waterfront setback requirements?
It doesn't. Bill 44 does not affect setbacks, period. Okay. They've got a policy manual where they recommend what the numbers might look like, but they don't actually change any of the setbacks in your existing zoning. Okay. So that's one of the things that a municipality will be looking at when they do their zoning bylaw update. Should we make some changes? There's nothing that compels them to.
Okay. Here's an environmental and a geographic question, just with respect to the carrying capacity of the land, the ability to sustain through food security. Basically, these bills are focused just on housing, but the impacts on the watershed and the water supply, food sustainability in the CRD, the impact on the landfill is another example of this. I think you can add into, well, let's just leave it at that, because let's leave it at the environmental perspective. I asked the question whether or not there was an analysis done on the urban tree canopy as an example of Vancouver or of the Capital Regional District, what the potential of more lot coverage, what the potential impacts of that could be, and then the rights that are given the developer to cut trees and replace them with newly planted trees as an example. So do you have any thoughts on what the impact on the environment are with respect to both our ability to the natural services, and then as well the impact on the on trees, etc.?
So this is something they actually talk about in that policy manual for the small scale multi-unit, and they're of the view that the municipalities should be able to manage the development approvals in a manner that essentially preserves the tree canopy, because you're not doing 100% lot coverage, so you have some flexibility where trees can go and stuff like that. That's the response in the policy manual. In practice, more floor area, more density usually translates to more lot coverage, more driveway, and living area, outside living area like patios and stuff. That is that doesn't work very well at trying to preserve tree canopy. Like, increasing density and preserving tree canopy is really challenging. So a lot of the efforts are to mitigate the loss are planting trees elsewhere on boulevards and public property and all that kind of stuff to make up for it, but not necessarily right on the development. Where we have significant tree stands in Sidney, those are actually defined in environmentally sensitive areas, like the Beaufort Road area is specifically to preserve that Beaufort Grove. And they discourage subdivision, and they encourage flexibility on setbacks, etc., for the sake of preserving trees, and it's all laid out in the guidelines. So there are some tools that a municipality can use to try to address that topic. But the simple answer, more density generally means less trees.
Replacing a mature tree with a newly planted tree in a boulevard is not equivalent. It's not the same thing. So,
No.
I think that that this was one of those moments in which I was quite frustrated in the debate, because the reality of the heat dome that we experienced just a few summers ago, as an example, anywhere where there was a tree canopy, or there was a mature tree canopy in a community, was the safest place to go, frankly, out of the sun. And anyway,
I won't disagree with that, but an important thing for urban forestry is you've got to regenerate the trees. You can't let them over mature, because what happens is when they eventually go, and they will, you have this huge gap in the canopy, and you've got nothing coming up to replace it. Where if you keep that rolling planting program going, you have new trees coming up, new canopy. You've got to.
Yeah, not disputing that at all. I'm not disputing that. I'm just suggesting that if the tree canopy is coming down in now new developable areas like this bill creates. Anyway, that's okay. So there is a question here from. The question about what will happen if municipalities decide to not implement these rules. We're seeing a number of different boards, and the Metro Vancouver board had an in-camera discussion about this. Sidney, Central Saanich is having discussions about this. So, are there any municipalities that are going to refuse, and what would be the recourse on the provincial government if they decided to?
So, all the authority that a municipal council has is delegated from the province. They can literally overrule everything. So if they want the zoning to look like this, they can just say, order in council, here it is, right?
Minister can actually act as the council.
Yeah. So the thing is that if anyone's going to play, you can't make us do this, we're not going to do this, they're probably going to find that somebody will do a much poorer job writing their new bylaw than they would have if they just sucked it up and did it. And I point to that New Westminster bus exchange, the one that reaches right across the Fraser River. That's an example of the kind of quality you might get if you force their hand to overrule you.
All right. Well, we've gone over time here now. This seems like a good place to end it. Thank you, Peter, for this good discussion and for your presentation. It was greatly appreciated this evening. And I hope that people go away from this conversation with deeper knowledge of the bills that were passed this past fall, and just, I guess, what to keep your eye on. Do you have any final comments? And then I'll invite Tex back into the room, and you can close us down in a good way here.
Yeah. One thing I was going to do, I mentioned that the slide deck was available for anyone who wanted it. I have just posted it in the chat. You can, if you want a copy of it, go to the chat, click on the link, and just download it.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'll make a pitch here as we provide these events free of charge. And I should have mentioned this earlier, and it's in the comments. If you're moved to do so, we just ask that you make a contribution to the Saanich Peninsula Food Bank, and there's a link also in the chat there as well. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Good luck in your presentation on Sunday. I hope it goes as smoothly as it went today, and I really appreciate the insights that you provided us. And I'll turn it over to Tex.
Once again, let me thank you, Peter. Much appreciated to help us try and understand this complicated and really, really, this is impactful, and we appreciate you taking the time to help us sort through that. I just wanted this to, in addition to thanking you, let folks know that we're in discussion right now with Bryony Penn and a couple other folks, one from Victoria and one from up north in the Gulf Islands, up north, the Northern Islands, and they're working to set up a herring conservation and restoration group. And we've been talking with them about coming in to join Adam. They've got a film that they've made, and we've got a tentative date of March 14. So we'll keep you posted on that one. We thank Bryony for helping us put that together, and we'll look forward to sharing that with you in the coming weeks. And Adam, I think I'm basically done. Thank you.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And Peter, do you want to leave the? There's still a few people in the room. Do you want to tell people when the Sidney conversation, when and where the Sidney conversation is, sure, and when and where they might be able to find it on Radio Sidney?
Okay. So we recorded this session tonight, and Radio Sidney is going to put that up as a podcast. Probably take us a couple of days to do that, but it will be on radiosidney.ca. You'll be able to find it through there. I'll have a link to it off my Facebook page as well. That's Peninsula Affairs, Radio Sidney, Peter Wainwright, if you're looking for it. I don't think we're too hard to find. We have a panel discussion happening on Sunday. It's jointly hosted by the Sidney Community Association and Radio Sidney. In addition to myself, we've got Jordan Milne, who's the CEO of GMC Projects. That he's a developer, the proponent of the Cedarwood, very knowledgeable on affordable housing, workforce housing, that kind of stuff, but developer's perspective. And we have Jarrett Matanowicz, who's the director of planning for Central Saanich, who will be, giving his perspective. And he's got, all the knowledge of how it applies in ALR and that kind of stuff that isn't really a Sidney kind of thing. And then on February 7th, I'm going to be giving a talk to the North Saanich Residents Association meeting, again, on housing. So, and that one will be specific to North Saanich. So if you're interested in any of those, they're free to attend.
So join the Peter Wainwright Housing Tour, basically. All right. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate our conversations and what you brought to the conversation tonight. Thank you so much, and wishing everybody well, and have a good evening.
Thanks for having me.